What do Jeanne Eagles, Joan Crawford, Rita Hayworth, Candy Darling, and Marilyn Monroe all have in common? A character named Sadie Thompson. And why were all of these glamorous women obsessed with playing this character? Well, because Sadie Thompson is a scandalous woman. She's the kind of woman that the world loves to watch and to punish. So if all these glamorous women were obsessed with playing this role, why don't you know what I'm talking about? Why haven't you heard of Sadie Thompson? That's a good question, and one that we are going to dive into in this video today. But before I get into the lore, hi, my name is Kate, and I am the creator of The Factory, which is an immersive show about the world of Andy Warhol and the events that led to his attempted assassination by Valerie Solanas. It's an immersive show that I've been working on producing in Brooklyn. We just did a workshop a couple weeks ago. I am fundraising to do the full production, hopefully at the end of 2025. And as part of my journey as an independent producer and weirdo obsessed with old Hollywood and Warhol and all of these things, I've been making these YouTube videos where I talk about some of the inspirations, some of the lore, the backstories that got me interested in writing this show. And so I've been having a very good time on this YouTube channel talking about old Hollywood, Warhol stars, The Factory, art history, and the way that pop culture recycles itself. And this story is a mystery, it's creepy, it's weird, it's inspiring, it's so many things, and I don't think that anybody that I have seen has ever talked about this, at least on YouTube. So we're going to get into it, and let's just jump straight in. Oh, I forgot. Subscribe to the channel. Subscribe, it really helps me out. But let's talk about Rain, because oh my God, what a story. So, spoiler alert, I'm going to tell you the plot of Rain because to understand everything else that we're going to talk about, you just need to know what this play is about, because that's how this video works. So here's the very loose plot of Rain. And again, I have to stress, there are many versions and iterations of this story, so the details change a little bit, but here's the basic plot. Rain is the story of a woman named Sadie Thompson who gets stuck on an island in the same hotel as this preacher named Mr. Davidson. Now, Sadie Thompson has washed up on this island, you know, not literally, but she got to this island in the South Pacific. Some stories allude to the fact that maybe she came from a red light district in Hawaii. Other versions are a little more mysterious about her past, but she's a good time girl. She maybe was a sex worker, maybe she's committed some crimes in the past. It's never totally clear, but what is clear is that Sadie Thompson is a good time girl. She likes to have fun, she likes men, she's single, she's not going to be tied down. So Sadie Thompson is kind of stuck on this island in the South Pacific. There's this big storm that's blown in, and it's lasted for days, and so all of the boats are kind of trapped on this island, so nobody can leave. She's staying at this hotel. Now, another man is also kind of trapped on this island, and it's this missionary named Mr. Davidson. And Mr. Davidson is there with his wife, and he's in the same boat, or not on a boat. He can't get a boat because of this storm. So they're in the same situation. They're both staying at this hotel together, and no one can leave because of this big storm. Now, Sadie Thompson, good time girl, Mr. Davidson, missionary. And he, as soon as he lays eyes on Sadie, he cannot handle it. He can't stand her. He makes it his mission to save her. So this kicks off this kind of battle between Sadie and Reverend Davidson. And as Sadie fights to keep her independence, Mr. Davidson struggles to control her. But like most men who are obsessed with a woman that they claim to hate, Mr. Davidson's morality is really only skin deep. In fact, he is just obsessed with her in a more normal kind of way. He just loves her. And so he's trying to convince Sadie that she needs to be saved, she needs to repent, she needs to like atone for her sins. And at first Sadie is like very resistant and is like, leave me alone. But the longer this storm goes on, and it drags on for days, Mr. Davidson like really gets into Sadie's head. And she starts to believe Mr. Davidson, and she starts to kind of come under his spell. And he convinces her to, when the storm lets up, that they're gonna leave together, and he's gonna like take her somewhere where she can become a saved Christian woman. And all of her like other friends on the island are like, Sadie, no, what are you doing? This man is controlling you. Like, and they're trying to help her escape, but she's just become brainwashed. And she's like, no, 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 I have to be saved. I'm a sinner. And everyone's kind of horrified that this is happening. And then at the peak of this story, Mr. Davidson and Sadie, they end up in each other's arms. And again, I have to say there are many different versions of the story. Some are a little more explicit on what happens. Some kind of allude to maybe Mr. Davidson assaulted her. Maybe this was a non-consensual event. We don't really know. And it doesn't really matter, because the result of this union between them ends up at the next morning, the men that are Sadie's friends that have been horrified at the thought of her leaving with Mr. Davidson, they knock on her door, and Sadie's back to normal. She's back to her old ways. She's listening to records, she's drinking, she's having a good time, as if this Mr. Davidson never existed. And around the same time, Mr. Davidson's body is found on the beach, and his throat has been sliced. Did he kill himself? I don't know. Did Sadie kill him? I don't know. But the end of the story is that Mr. Davidson is dead, and Sadie Thompson cannot be... You can't keep a good girl down. So in the end, the storm clears, and Sadie gets to walk away. She retains her independence. She is released from all of the shame that Mr. Davidson tried to put on her, and from the idea that she needed to be controlled in the first place. It's a pretty radical story, especially for the time that it was written. And so I think you can maybe see why all of these women were drawn to this character. She's really strong. She is shamed for her sexuality. A man is obsessed with her, tries to control her, tries to get her to repent for the sin of basically being an attractive woman. And in the end, he gets what was coming to him, whether that was from her or by his own hand. We don't know exactly what happened to Mr. Davidson. We only know that he dies. So now we're going to get into the wild twists and turns that this play has taken over the course of the last century. So we're going to rewind the clock now, and we're going to go all the way back to the early 1900s, when vaudeville was the primary source of entertainment in America. Vaudeville, if you don't know, was the most popular entertainment form at the dawn of the 20th century. Before film, before TV, when radio was barely a thing, vaudeville, live entertainment, was the most popular form of American entertainment. And anybody could kind of pull together an act and try and make it on the vaudeville circuit. And basically, it was all of these theaters all across America that would host traveling performers who had an act. And an act could be pretty much anything. Singers, dancers, comedians, whatever you could do, make it into an act, you could potentially do it on the vaudeville circuit. And so performers would travel from theater to theater all across the country doing their acts. That's basically what vaudeville was. And so the dawn of the 20th century, the early 1900s, there is this girl named Jeanne Eagles. And Jeanne Eagles was traveling with the Dubinsky Brothers Traveling Theater Show, was the name of it. And she starts off as a dancer, but she quickly gains the attention of audience members, and people are really loving Jeanne Eagles. And so she moves from being a dancer to being like more of a leading lady. In 1911, Jeanne Eagles moves to New York City, and she tries to make it as a Broadway showgirl. Her hair is naturally brown, but in her mind, a star has blonde hair, and so she bleaches her hair blonde to make herself stand out from the other girls auditioning for these Broadway shows. In 1916, she becomes a Ziegfeld girl. And she joins the long-running Broadway revue, The Ziegfeld Follies, which, if you are a super theater nerd like me, you would know that the Ziegfeld Follies is like one of the first really big Broadway spectacles. It's not even really like a show in terms of having a plot. It just is, you know, kind of like proto Busby Berkeley, like very just big costumes and tons of girls and like human beings being chandeliers and like, you know, just like opulent, ridiculous extravaganzas. That's what the Ziegfeld Follies were. So it's World War I, 1916. Jeanne Eagles is on Broadway in the Ziegfeld Follies. Across the ponds, well, across many ponds, a man named Somerset Maugham, and again, if I am saying that wrong, I sincerely apologize to Mr. Maugham. We're gonna call him Somerset because that's easier for me to say. So Somerset has joined the British Secret Service, and he has been stationed in the South Pacific to gather intelligence. And so he's basically a spy. And while he's staying in the South Pacific, he's kind of traveling in the area of the Samoan Islands. So he's in the South Seas gathering intelligence, and he's specifically looking for information about this like secret radio transmitter that somebody has in this region. Maybe it's the Germans, maybe it's somebody else, we don't know, but Somerset is on the case. And he's brought somebody with him. Gerald Haxton is Somerset's companion and secretary. He is also his secret gay lover. Not really like a big part of the story, but I thought it was interesting. I got pulled into a rabbit hole researching this. Apparently Haxton was banned from the US because he had been caught a few years earlier engaging in homosexual activities, and he was prosecuted under the same laws that they used to prosecute Oscar Wilde. Apparently Oscar Wilde had this big trial that ended up affecting a lot of gay people in England. Afterwards, it like kind of spread out, and like many people were prosecuted after Oscar Wilde was prosecuted. So just interesting side note to history there. So Somerset and his companion, Mr. Haxton, are being secret gay lovers in the South Pacific while also gathering intelligence for the British Army. Very World War I chic, very dramatic, very mysterious. So they're on this island, and something happens while they're traveling in the South Pacific. They're on this boat called the Sonoma, and the boat gets docked because of a quarantine inspection. And so they are stuck on this island for a few days and forced to stay in a hotel. And they are forced to stay in this hotel with some other passengers from the Sonoma. And the other passengers that they have to stay with are a woman named Miss Sadie Thompson and a missionary named Mr. Davidson. So Somerset, who is working for the British Secret Service, is also a famous writer, and he is always looking for inspiration for his stories and his plays in his regular life. And so I think we can all see where the genesis of the story for Rain comes from. It's 1917. We're back in America. And Jeanne Eagles, our vaudeville star, has snagged a couple roles here and there. She's in the Ziegfeld Follies, but then she gets kind of her first big break. And it is in the Broadway show called Hamilton. No, not that Hamilton. There was, apparently, I also learned this in researching this video, there was a Broadway show about Alexander Hamilton, also called Hamilton, that happened in 1917, and Jeanne Eagles plays Maria Reynolds, who is the woman that Hamilton has an affair with. It blew my mind that we all know the Hamilton that happened more recently, the hip hop Hamilton. All that talk about Hamilton and how genius it was of Lin-Manuel Miranda to write a Broadway show about Alexander Hamilton. Who would ever think to write a Broadway show about Alexander Hamilton when somebody already did write a Broadway show about Alexander Hamilton? Why did that not come up more? Just side note, why did that not come up more? Some interesting facts about the 1917 version of Hamilton. One, it was very well received at the time. And another interesting fact is that this play was written by a woman. Her name was Mary Hamlin, and she was a 46-year-old high society woman and mother of 4 who claimed that playwriting was her secret desire. So just a fun fact, Hamilton, not the first Hamilton. So Jeanne Eagles has really moved up in the world pretty fast. She was a vaudeville actress, and then she moves to New York, she bleaches her hair, she gets to be a Ziegfeld girl in the Ziegfeld Follies, and now she's on Broadway in a real show as a real character. She plays Maria Reynolds, the woman who seduced Alexander Hamilton. Wow. So April 21st, 1921, the short story Miss Thompson appears in the Smart Set, which is an American literary magazine, and the story is inspired by Somerset's time in the South Pacific. Then, November 7th, 1922, Jeanne Eagles makes her Broadway debut in Rain, which is a Broadway play that was based off of the short story. And the play is a huge hit, and this play really makes Jeanne Eagles a star. So Rain is this huge hit, but it also was really, really scandalous because this is a play that features a sexually liberated woman. It features a missionary who's kind of the bad guy. So the themes of this show are sexual liberation, religious hypocrisy, colonialism, which are pretty scandalous topics for early 20th century America. I mean, the narrative centers on Sadie Thompson, who is this free-spirited woman, and the bad guy in this tale is Mr. Davidson, who is this missionary and preacher. And the show is kind of about how the rigid patriarchal morality of these religions, maybe it's not a good thing. And so because of these themes, the play is considered very controversial, and it's even banned in some places. So it's this big hit, but it's also this scandal. So Rain is this big hit, even though it's a scandal. The scandal makes it, as always, kind of more of a hit. And Jeanne Eagles starts touring the country with the play Rain. She tours with Rain for 2 years. So Jeanne Eagles, now a star. And we're gonna shift our attention to another up-and-comer on the vaudeville circuit. Lucille Lesueur is rising the ranks on vaudeville, and she's dancing in choruses, kind of doing the same thing that Jeanne Eagles did. And she makes her way to Detroit, and she gets the attention of somebody named Jacob J. Schubert. Schubert is a very well-known producer in New York City, and he invites Lucille to move to New York. So Lucille gets to New York, and she makes her Broadway debut in the show Innocent Eyes at the Winter Garden Theater, which is produced by Mr. Schubert. As this is happening, Jeanne Eagles is starting to unravel. She's touring with Rain, but her alcohol use, which was once moderate, has gotten really heavy, and she's also started to get into heroin. So she has kind of started the burnout cycle of a superstar. But she's still a star. She's still touring with Rain. So December 24th, 1924, Lucille Lesueur has taken on Broadway, and now MGM offers Lucille a contract for $75 a week. The only catch is the publicity department thinks that her last name, Lesueur, kind of sounds too much like a sewer. And so they decide to run a contest in a magazine called Name the Star, and they ask the readers to pick a new name for this new Hollywood star. And the winner of the contest is the name Joan Crawford. In the fall of 1926, Jeanne Eagles, who has been on the road with Rain and struggling with a heroin addiction, returns to Broadway for Rain's farewell performance. After that performance, that was in the fall of 1926, in December, Jeanne Eagles is cast as Roxy Hart in the new play Chicago. And she's kind of temperamental and hard to work with at this point. There's a director attached to direct Chicago, but Jeanne Eagles demands that he be replaced. And so he is. A new director is brought on, but that still does not satisfy Jeanne Eagles, and kind of in a temperamental rage, Jeanne Eagles quits Chicago. So She was meant to be the original Roxy Hart, but that does not happen. On January 7th, 1928, a silent film called Sadie Thompson debuts in America, and it is based on the play Rain. And this silent film stars Gloria Swanson as Sadie Thompson. Also, Lionel Barrymore plays Mr. Davidson. Interesting fun fact. October 3rd, 1929, Jeanne Eagles dies at a Manhattan hospital. And her death is attributed to an overdose of chloral hydrate, which is something that she had been using to sleep, but an autopsy revealed that she still had alcohol in her system and heroin, and that she had been suffering from something called alcoholic psychosis in the days leading up to her death. So she was hallucinating, she was not in reality, she was very much struggling. She goes to the hospital for an already scheduled appointment and just happens to collapse while she's there and pass away. But the world moves on pretty fast, and on October 12th, 1932, Hollywood gets its hands on Rain again, and now we're into the talking era. And so Joan Crawford, formerly Lucille LeSueur, the vaudeville star, now she's a Hollywood icon, and Joan Crawford stars in a new version of Rain. And this version is a little more sanitized, a little more censorship friendly than the silent movie version. So just to recap the journey of Rain so far, we started out in the South Pacific Islands with this secret gay spy couple who are trapped in a hotel with somebody named Sadie Thompson and somebody else named Mr. Davidson. Then Somerset, one of the members of that gay spy couple, he writes a story called Miss Thompson that appears in a magazine. Then the short story gets adapted into a play that makes it to Broadway starring Jeanne Eagles. Then Jeanne Eagles goes on the road, tours with Rain for 2 years while Lucille LeSueur is coming up on Broadway. Lucille LeSueur makes it on Broadway, she gets an MGM contract, and then they're like, your name sucks, we gotta give you a new name. They run a contest in a magazine, the winning name is Joan Crawford. So she becomes Joan Crawford, infamous woman that we all know and love. As she's coming up in the MGM studios, Gloria Swanson stars in a silent picture movie version of Rain. Then Joan Crawford, who is now a megastar, stars in another version of Rain, but this time it's a real like talking picture and not a silent version. So that's the story so far. Then, in 1953, Rain returns to the screen, but this time it's Rita Hayworth starring in a 3D version of Rain, which is hilarious to me. 3D was very popular in the mid-1950s. There was tons of movies that were made 3D. I don't know why this morality tale about a prostitute and a preacher was made into a 3D movie. I don't know what about this film said this should be 3D, but it was. 1957, the actress Kim Novak stars in a biopic about Jeanne Eagles. And this is relevant. This is how this whole story got onto my radar, because Candy Darling, the Warhol superstar, was obsessed with Kim Novak. Candy Darling, as a young kid in the 1950s, her parents went through a really bad divorce, and while she was struggling with this bad home life, she gets obsessed with Kim Novak and watching Kim Novak movies. And so one of the films that Candy Darling watched was this biopic called Jeanne Eagles, where Kim Novak stars as Jeanne Eagles. And side note, I have seen this film and I highly recommend it. It is the most insane, campiest movie that I have ever watched. I've seen it 3 times because I saw it myself. I was like, what is this movie? This movie is crazy. And then I had to show it to 2 more people because it is the definition of camp. If you look up camp in the dictionary, it would just be the full version of the biopic Jeanne Eagles starring Kim Novak. It is that crazy. Highly recommend. So moving right along, now we're in the 1960s. August 4th, 1962, Marilyn Monroe passes away. And I don't have to tell you who Marilyn Monroe was or why this was important, but what is very interesting to me is that when Marilyn Monroe died, she was also in talks to play Sadie in a new version of Rain. This production obviously never happened because Marilyn Monroe passes away. But one more person who is now linked to the character Sadie Thompson. Now, fun fact, the day after Marilyn Monroe died, Andy Warhol, who has a very good sense of timing, he makes his famous Marilyn Monroe paintings. And this is one of the things that catapults Andy Warhol into the national spotlight. I'm not going to dive into all of this because I have many other videos about Andy Warhol and the factory, but just an interesting side note as to how this story of Rain kind of got onto my radar. So Marilyn Monroe, she dies. Andy Warhol, he's coming up as a new big star. And he has the factory. And all these people start hanging out at the factory. And one of those people is Candy Darling. Candy Darling is one of Warhol's superstars. And Candy Darling was really famous for doing these monologues of Kim Novak films. And so Candy Darling, who's hanging out at the factory, starts doing this monologue that Kim Novak did in the film Jeanne Eagles. So if you can imagine the layers of identity that we're playing with here, it's Candy Darling doing Kim Novak, doing Jeanne Eagles, doing Sadie Thompson. It's a lot. And super twisty fun note for me, as I mentioned, I wrote this immersive show about the factory, and I wrote it in the style of another kind of secret play called Heaven Grand in Amber Orbit, which was written by Jackie Curtis, another Warhol superstar. Jackie Curtis wrote Heaven Grand in Amber Orbit in the cut and paste method, which was she took all this dialogue from other plays and movies and books and interviews and cut and paste it to make a new play. So all the dialogue in Heaven Grand in Amber Orbit comes from other sources. I was inspired by that when I wrote my show. So all of my dialogue in the factory comes from other sources, and some of those sources are the play Rain. And so in my show, when Candy Darling is quoting Rain, it adds another layer to it. So it's actually the actress in my show playing Candy Darling, who is doing Kim Novak, doing Jeanne Eagles, doing Sadie. So it's 5 layers of identity. Anyway, it's just a fun fact about my show. But that is not the end of Rain. In 1980, Rain becomes a porn film directed by a man named Bob Chin. And then in the 90s, Rain becomes an opera by Richard Owen, who I looked up and also was a congressman. So fun fact about him. So yeah, I just thought it was funny that Rain has had all of these iterations. It was a short story, it was a Broadway play, it was a silent film, it was a talking film, it was a 3D film, it was a porn, and it was an opera. It has gone through so many different versions and iterations. And for all of these different versions, it still is not a well-known play. Okay, and so we're gonna kind of wrap it up here, but I wanted to add one more note onto just how kind of kooky and weird this research went. When I was doing my research, I noticed that Jeanne Eagles, when she died, she had her funeral at a place called Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. And the name kind of pinged in my brain. I was like, I think that I've heard of this place before. And so I looked it up, and I had heard of it before because last week I made a video on Judy Garland, and Judy Garland also had her funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral chapel. And I was like, that's weird. That's probably why I heard of it. But then I started looking into it deeper, and I realized a lot of people have had their funeral at Frank E. Campbell's funeral house. And the weirdest twist to me is that Jeanne Eagles, Joan Crawford, Rita Hayworth, and Candy Darling all had their funerals at Frank E. Campbell's funeral house. So 4 of the women who played Sadie all had their funerals at the same place. Super interesting, super creepy, super spooky. Actually, comment below if you would like to hear about Frank E. Campbell's funeral house as its own video, because oh my god, so many people had their funerals there. So here's just some other people that have had their funerals there just for fun. Heath Ledger, John Lennon, Jackie Kennedy, Rudolph Valentino, the notorious B.I.G., among others. So if you want to see a video about maybe this funeral chapel, let me know. And we're gonna leave it there. I saw this play, Rain, it just kept popping up, and I wanted to talk about it because I thought that it was really interesting that so many people were linked to this play, and yet it remains kind of a mystery and isn't really popular. So maybe it wasn't forgotten at all. Maybe it's the kind of show that just shows up when you need it. Do we need it now? I think it's timely. I think it's relevant. I think that maybe we should have a new version of Rain. So I'm curious, I would like to ask you, what kind of version of Rain would you be interested in seeing now? Do you think we should make another porno, another opera, another Broadway show? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. So thank you for watching. I'm gonna leave it there. This was just an interesting dive into this mysterious play. So if you liked it, give me a like, hit subscribe. I make all sorts of videos about old Hollywood and Andy Warhol and Andy Warhol's factory and New York art history and punk rock history and scandals. So if you like that kind of content, hit subscribe and I will see you next time.